The floor was the last thing. It always was. After the steel counters were scrubbed until they shone with a cold, lunar light, after the copper pots were polished to a dull, rosy gleam, and after the great black stove was cooled and wiped clean of the day's violence, there was the floor. It was a sea of old quarry tiles, worn smooth by a century of footsteps, each one a small story of service and sweat. To clean it was not a chore. It was a sacrament. Alara moved with an economy born of long practice. She was not a large woman. Her hair, pulled back in a severe bun, was threaded with more gray than black. Her face was a map of lines that spoke not of laughter, but of long hours staring into heat and pressure. Her hands, however, were the truest testament to her life. They were not the delicate, scarred hands of a chef, but the strong, calloused hands of a builder, a shaper of things. She worked in the kitchen of The Alibi, a restaurant that was itself a quiet lie, a respectable front for dealings that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with appetite. She knew this. She did not care. Her domain was bordered by the swinging kitchen doors and the heavy steel of the back exit. Within these borders, she was the only law. The water in the bucket was scalding hot, laced with the sharp, clean scent of pine and bleach. It was a smell of erasure, of wiping the slate clean for the next day. The mop she used was old, its wooden handle worn to a silky texture that fit the grip of her palms perfectly. She moved backward across the tiles, her strokes even and overlapping, a rhythmic swish and pull that echoed in the cavernous, silent kitchen. Leo, the dishwasher, a boy barely 20 with eyes that were perpetually wide with a mixture of fear and admiration, watched her from the doorway. He had already clocked out, but he often stayed, mesmerized by her closing ritual. To him, she was not just the head cook. She was a kind of priestess, and this was her temple. He saw the way she worked, the absolute focus, the lack of any wasted motion. It was not the movement of a cook. It was the movement of a soldier, a surgeon, a master of some forgotten disciplined art. The last tile was wiped clean. The water, now a murky gray, was poured down the industrial drain. The mop was rinsed and hung, the bucket scrubbed and placed upside down to dry. Alara stood for a moment surveying her work. The wet floor gleamed under the single, humming fluorescent light left on for the cleaners. It was perfect. A pristine, unbroken surface. A world in miniature, brought to order by her own two hands. This was her piece. It was a fragile piece, built each night from soap and water and discipline. But it was all she had left. In the quiet that followed, the only sound was the slow, steady drip of a faucet she had yet to fix. Drip, drip, drip. A clock measuring out the silence. It was in that silence that a new sound was born. It began as a low vibration felt more than heard, a tremor in the concrete foundation of the old building. It grew into the deep, guttural rumble of powerful engines, too many of them, idling just outside the back alley. Leo shifted his weight, his young face tightening with anxiety. That was not the sound of the linen delivery truck or the late-night garbage collection. That was the sound of money and menace. Alara did not turn. She remained still, her back to the rear exit, her posture unchanged. She had heard engines like that before, in another life, in a place of sand and dust and broken promises. They were the sound of predators arriving. The heavy steel door, which should have been bolted from the inside, groaned open. A wedge of cold night air sliced into the warm, damp kitchen. It carried with it the smell of wet asphalt, expensive cigar smoke, and something else, the metallic tang of ozone, the scent of a gathering storm. 3 men filled the doorway. They were not restaurant staff. They were large, dressed in dark suits that seemed too tight for their shoulders, their bodies thick with the kind of muscle built for intimidation, not labor. They moved with a swaggering arrogance, their eyes sweeping the kitchen not with interest, but with the casual disdain of conquerors. They were wolves in a sheepfold, and they knew it. One of them, a man with a scarred lip and a neck as thick as a piling, grinned at Leo. The boy flinched, shrinking back into the shadows of the dry storage pantry. The man's grin widened. He enjoyed the fear. It was a currency he understood. He and his companions stepped inside, their polished leather shoes leaving wet, muddy tracks across Alara's immaculate floor. Each footprint was a smear, a violation. They were shaped like leaves, a pattern from a forest floor or a manicured estate. Dark soil and crushed vegetation ground into the grout lines of her clean tiles. It was a desecration. The men fanned out, their presence sucking the air from the room. They did not speak to Alara. They acted as if she were not there, a piece of kitchen equipment, a ghost in a white apron. One leaned against a steel counter, his knuckles grazing a stack of clean towels. Another ran a finger along the rim of a copper pot, checking it for dust, his expression a sneer of mock surprise at its cleanliness. They were marking their territory, their movements a slow, deliberate pollution of her sanctuary. Alara still had not moved. She remained a fixed point, a statue of quiet fury. She watched the mud multiply on her floor. She tracked the path of each man, her eyes missing nothing. She was calculating, assessing, waiting. The dripping of the faucet continued its patient rhythm, a counterpoint to the thudding of Leo's heart in the pantry. Then the space in the doorway was filled again. The change was instantaneous. It was not a change in sound or light, but in pressure, as if a barometric system had suddenly shifted. The three men straightened up, their casual arrogance evaporating, replaced by a rigid, alert deference. They were no longer wolves. They were dogs, awaiting a command. The man who entered was not as large as his companions, but he occupied twice the space. He wore a charcoal gray suit of such perfect tailoring that it seemed less like clothing and more like a second skin. His shoes were handmade, gleaming despite the wet night, though they too carried the same leaf-patterned mud on their soles. His hair was silver at the temples, cut with military precision. He was perhaps 60, but his body was held with the coiled stillness of a predator in its prime. This was Mr. Valerius. He did not look at the kitchen. He did not look at his men. His eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on something beyond the swinging doors, on the restaurant's main dining room where the owner, a man named Sal, was waiting for him. Valerius was not a man who entered through back doors by choice. His presence here meant something had gone wrong, a matter requiring his personal, quiet attention. He walked forward, his stride unhurried, his posture erect. He, too, tracked a path of dark, rich mud across the gleaming tiles. His path was a straight line, a deliberate vector cutting directly through the center of Alara's ordered world. The mud he left was darker, richer, as if sourced from a deeper, older earth. He was a king, and the world was his carpet. He passed Alara without a glance. To him, she was invisible, a part of the scenery. The air crackled around him, a field of static electricity. His men fell into formation behind him, a phalanx of dark suits. The kitchen, Alara's sanctuary, had become a thoroughfare, a muddy path to a business transaction she could not comprehend and did not care about. All she cared about was the floor, the violation, the disrespect not for her, but for the work itself. For the principle of a clean space. It was a small principle in a world of large, ugly sins, but it was hers, and it was absolute. For a long moment after they passed, the only movement was the slow settling of displaced air. Then another sound joined the dripping faucet. It was faint, but clear. The scrape of a wooden handle being lifted from a metal hook. Alara turned. Her face was calm, her expression unreadable. She walked to the utility closet, her worn kitchen clogs making no sound on the tiles. Her movements were fluid, deliberate. There was no hesitation. She was not acting on impulse. This was a decision, a conclusion reached at the end of a long, silent calculation. She took down a broom. It was not a new one. The bristles were worn, stained from countless battles with the day's refuse. The wooden handle was scarred and faded, a tool that had seen years of honest labor. She also took a long-handled metal dustpan, the tools of her station, the symbols of her servitude. She held the broom in her right hand, the dustpan in her left. She turned and began to walk toward the swinging doors through which Valerius and his men had disappeared. Her path took her directly over the muddy tracks. She did not step around them. She walked through them, her own shoes now soiled, becoming part of the desecration she intended to address. Leo watched from the pantry, his hand over his mouth to stifle a gasp. He thought she was going to start cleaning. He thought she had simply accepted the violation, as everyone always did. He was wrong. The 3 bodyguards had not followed their boss into the main restaurant. They remained in the kitchen, a rear guard. They had resumed their relaxed, arrogant postures. The scarred one was speaking into his phone in a low, guttural language. The other 2 were murmuring to each other, their laughter quiet but contemptuous. They saw her approaching. The scarred man ended his call and pocketed his phone. He folded his thick arms, a smirk playing on his lips. "What's this, Grandma?" he said, his voice a gravelly rumble. "Time to sweep up?" His companions chuckled. They saw a cook, an old woman, a servant. They did not see the straightness of her spine, or the way she held the broom not like a tool for cleaning, but like a quarterstaff. They did not see the stillness in her eyes, a placid surface over an unfathomable depth. They saw what they expected to see. It was a fatal miscalculation. She did not stop at the edge of the mud. She did not speak to the guards. She walked past them as if they were furniture, her focus entirely on the swinging doors. One of the men, the youngest of the 3, reached out a hand to stop her, to grab her arm. He was not being aggressive, merely dismissive, like one might stop a stray dog from wandering where it shouldn't. "Don't go in there," he said, his tone bored. Before his fingers could make contact with her sleeve, she shifted her weight. It was a subtle movement, a barely perceptible pivot from her hips. The end of the broom handle swung in a short, tight arc, connecting with his outstretched wrist. There was a sharp, wet crack. The man's eyes widened in shock, then squeezed shut in a spasm of pure agony. He staggered back, clutching his arm, a string of curses hissing through his teeth. The other 2 were frozen for a fraction of a second. It was not the act itself that stunned them. Violence was their trade, but the source of it. The sheer, unbelievable audacity. The scarred man recovered first, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "You crazy old bitch!" He lunged, his big hands reaching for her throat. Alara did not retreat. She flowed. She used his own momentum against him, stepping inside his reach. The metal dustpan, held in her left hand, came up in a blur, its sharp edge catching him directly under the chin. His head snapped back with a sickening crunch of teeth. He stumbled backward, his eyes rolling up in their sockets, and crashed into a stack of aluminum trays with a sound like a thunderclap. The trays rained down around him as he slid to the floor, stunned and bleeding from the mouth. The 3rd guard, the one who had been laughing moments before, was now staring, his face pale, his hand hovering over the bulge of a pistol under his jacket. He was a professional. He understood what he had just seen. This was not a lucky shot from a frightened woman. This was precision. This was training. This was something that did not belong in a restaurant kitchen. Alara stood in the quiet aftermath, the broom and dustpan held loosely at her sides. She looked at the terrified guard. Her expression had not changed. She was still calm, still focused. The swinging doors to the dining room burst open. Mr. Valerius stood there, his face a mask of cold inquiry. He took in the scene in an instant, the man clutching a broken wrist, the other lying amidst a clatter of fallen trays, the third frozen in a half-draw, and the woman, the cook, standing at the center of it all, holding a broom. Valerius's eyes moved from his incapacitated men to Alara. There was no surprise in his gaze, no anger. There was only a deep, penetrating analysis. He looked at her, the way a grandmaster looks at a chessboard after an unexpected, brilliant move by his opponent. He saw the way she stood, her weight balanced, ready to move in any direction. He saw the grip on the broom handle, firm, but not tense. He saw the utter lack of fear in her eyes. What he saw was a peer, disguised in the humble vestments of a cook. He had built an empire on his ability to see the truth of a person beneath the surface, and the truth of this woman was ringing like a steel bell in the silent kitchen. The third guard, seeing his boss, finally found his voice. "Boss, this woman, she—" Valerius raised a single finger, a minute gesture that nonetheless carried the force of a physical blow. The guard's mouth snapped shut. Valerius's gaze did not leave Alara. He stepped over the threshold, back into the kitchen. He took a single step, then stopped, looking down at the muddy tracks on the floor, then back at her. The entire narrative of the moment was contained in that simple sequence of glances. He understood. This was not about his men. This was not an assault. This was about the mud. Alara took a step forward, then another. She walked directly toward the most dangerous man she had ever met, a man whose quietest whisper could extinguish lives. She walked past the guard with the broken wrist, who was now whimpering in a corner. She walked past the man on the floor, who was groggily trying to sit up. She walked until she was standing directly in front of Mr. Valerius, so close she could smell the faint, clean scent of lavender and starch from his shirt. She stopped. The kitchen was so quiet that the dripping faucet sounded like a hammer blow. Leo, still hidden in the pantry, felt as if his lungs had turned to stone. He was witnessing the end of the world. With a steady hand, Alara extended the broom, holding it out to Valerius. She did not offer the handle. She offered it sideways, a neutral presentation. A statement, not a request. Her eyes met his. They were clear, gray, and as hard as the quarry tiles beneath their feet. She said nothing. The silence was the real weapon. It was a silence that contained a history, a code, a challenge. It said, "You are in my house. You made a mess. The rules are the same for everyone." The surviving guard stared, his mind unable to process the scene. A cook was handing a broom to Vincent Valerius, the man they called the Undertaker because of his quiet, final solutions to business problems. It was an act of suicide. Valerius looked down at the worn broom. He looked at her calloused hands holding it. He saw the faint white scars on her knuckles, the ingrained strength. These were not the hands of a woman who had only ever kneaded dough. These were the hands of a woman who had held other things. He then looked back at her face. He was looking for a sign of madness, of desperation, of suicidal folly. He found none. He found only a profound and unshakable certainty. It was a quality he recognized because he possessed it himself. It was the bedrock of his entire existence. In that moment, he was not a crime boss, and she was not a cook. They were two sovereigns, meeting on the contested ground of a dirty floor, each defending the integrity of their own kingdom. A memory surfaced in Alara's mind, unbidden. Her father. Not in a kitchen, but in a dusty workshop filled with the scent of cut stone and metal. He was a stonemason, a man who believed in straight lines and true foundations. He had been showing her how to use a chisel, his large, gentle hand guiding hers. He had stopped, holding up a simple, worn mallet. "This is not just a tool, Alara," he had said, his voice quiet but resonant. "It is a promise. It promises to strike true if you hold it true." Every tool has its own honor. Your job is to live up to it. Her father had been a man of principles, a man who believed that even the smallest act, if done with integrity, held the universe in balance. He had been crushed by men like Valerius, men who believed in a different kind of power, a power that broke promises and tools, and people with equal indifference. That memory did not fuel her anger. It settled it, cooled it into something harder. A resolve as unyielding as her father's granite. Valerius felt the shift in her, the flicker of memory in her eyes. He was a student of human nature, and he could read the history of a life in a person's posture. He saw generations of quiet dignity in the way she stood. He saw a legacy being defended. He could have had her killed. A nod of his head was all it would take. His remaining man would draw his weapon, and it would be over. The thought crossed his mind, as it always did when his authority was challenged. It was a tactical assessment, cold and impersonal. But he dismissed it. Killing her would be a waste. It would be like burning a masterpiece to light a cigar. More than that, it would be a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. This was not a challenge to his power. It was an appeal to a shared code, a code she was betting he still possessed, buried deep beneath the silt of his violent life. He made his decision. He reached out, his manicured fingers closing not around the broom handle, but around her wrist. His grip was surprisingly gentle, yet possessed an immovable strength. He turned her hand over, examining her palm. He traced the lines of her calluses with his thumb. It was an intimate gesture, a shocking act of familiarity in the tense, cold room. "Where did you learn to stand your ground like this?" he asked. His voice was not a threat. It was a question of genuine curiosity, the inquiry of a collector who has just stumbled upon an impossibly rare artifact. "My father taught me that a clean floor is the beginning of a good life," she replied, her voice steady, low. It was not the answer to the question he had asked, but it was the truest answer she could give. It was the answer her father would have wanted her to give. Valerius held her gaze for a moment longer, then released her wrist. He took the broom from her. The transfer was silent, seamless. The guard behind him took an involuntary step forward, his hand once again moving toward his weapon, his face a mask of disbelief. Valerius shot him a look so cold, so filled with silent annihilation, that the man physically recoiled, as if he had touched a live wire. And then, Vincent Valerius, a man whose name was spoken in whispers in the halls of power and the back alleys of the city, began to sweep the kitchen floor. He did not do it with theatrical self-abasement or with resentful anger. He did it with a quiet, focused diligence. His movements were clumsy at first. He was a man unaccustomed to such tools, a king attempting peasant's work, but he was a man of immense discipline, and he learned quickly. He swept the mud he had tracked, his strokes becoming more efficient, more methodical. He pushed the dark soil into a neat pile. He then took the dustpan from Alara, crouched, an act of submission that made the guard flinch, and swept the pile into the pan. He rose and walked to the garbage receptacle, emptying the dustpan with a soft, metallic rattle. He then returned the broom and dustpan to Alara, placing them into her hands with the solemnity of a knight returning a sacred sword. He looked at the floor. It was not perfect. There were still faint smears, but the desecration was gone. An act of respect had been paid. A debt had been settled. The kitchen was quiet once more, the dripping faucet and the pained groans of the injured men the only sounds. Valerius looked at his men on the floor, his expression one of profound disappointment. Not because they had been defeated, but because they had failed to see what he had seen. They had mistaken a lioness for a house cat. "Get them out of here," he said to the standing guard. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of glass. The guard, galvanized by the command, hurried to comply. He hauled the man with the broken teeth to his feet, propping him up. The other man, cradling his shattered wrist, staggered up on his own, his face slick with sweat. They were a pathetic sight, their arrogance stripped away, leaving only the raw, humiliating truth of their failure. They stumbled out the back door, a retreat of shame. Valerius was now alone with Alara and the invisible, terrified boy in the pantry. He did not leave immediately. He stood there, studying her. The transaction that had brought him here, the meeting with the restaurant owner, was forgotten, or at least postponed. A more important transaction had just taken place. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a slim, elegant wallet. From it, he extracted a business card. It was thick black stock with a single name embossed in silver, nothing more. Valerius. No title, no number, no address. The name was all that was needed. He held it out to her. "I have a great many kitchens," he said. "They are run by chefs. They are clean, but they are not run with honor. A person of your caliber is wasted here." This was not a job offer. It was a recruitment. An invitation into his world, a world of shadows and violence, but a world also governed by its own brutal, unyielding code. A world, he suspected, that she had once known. Alara looked at the card. She saw the name, and she understood the weight of it. She understood the power it represented, the doors it could open, the lives it could end. She could take it. She could step back into the world she had fled, a world of consequence and danger, but also of purpose. She could have protection, wealth, influence. All she had to do was take the card. She looked away from it, her gaze sweeping over her kitchen. She saw the gleam of the clean copper, the stark white of the stacked towels, the worn handle of the mop hanging in its proper place. She saw the quarry tile floor, now clean again. This was her kingdom. It was small. It was humble. It was built on the simple, unbreakable principles her father had taught her. It was a world of her own making, a sanctuary she had built out of the ashes of another life. "I am a cook," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was a refusal. It was a declaration. It was the truest thing she had said all night. Valerius was not offended. He seemed to have expected it. A slow nod of understanding. He did not retract the card. Instead, he placed it carefully on the edge of the stainless steel prep counter, aligning it perfectly with the corner. It sat there, a black rectangle on a sea of silver, a silent offer left open. He turned to leave. At the door, he paused. He looked back at her one last time. "Your father would be proud," he said. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had arrived. The cold air rushed in. Then the heavy door swung shut with a final, metallic sigh, the bolt clicking into place. Silence descended once more. A different kind of silence. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the residue of what had just happened, with the weight of choices made and paths not taken. Leo finally emerged from the pantry. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a miracle or a nightmare, and wasn't sure which. He stared at Alara, his eyes wide with a new, profound respect that bordered on worship. He looked at the black card on the counter. He looked at the floor. It was still clean. Alara did not look at the card. She picked up her bucket, filled it with fresh hot water, and poured in the sharp-smelling pine cleaner. She took up her mop. She started at the far end of the kitchen and began to wash the floor again, her movements exactly the same as before. Rhythmic, even, overlapping. She was erasing the last faint smears of mud, but she was also erasing the intrusion, reclaiming her space, restoring her own internal order. Swish, pull, swish, pull. The familiar ritual was an anchor in the sudden, violent storm of her life. When she was finished, the floor was perfect once more, gleaming under the fluorescent light, as if nothing had ever happened. Weeks passed. The rhythm of the kitchen returned to its normal state. The seasons began to turn. Alara continued her work. She never mentioned the night of the intrusion. Leo, for his part, never spoke of it either, but he moved with a new reverence around her, his work in the dish pit more meticulous, his respect for her sanctuary absolute. He had seen the truth behind the curtain, and it had changed him. The black business card remained on the counter for 3 days. Alara worked around it, never touching it, never acknowledging its presence. On the 4th day, it was gone. Leo assumed she had thrown it away. She had not. She had tucked it into the back of an old recipe book, a memento of a battle she had not sought, but had won on her own terms. One crisp autumn morning, a delivery truck arrived. It was not one of their usual suppliers. The men who unloaded the cargo were silent and efficient, dressed in the dark uniforms of a high-end logistics company. They brought in a single, large wooden crate. There was no bill of lading, no return address, just the name of the restaurant stenciled on the side. The owner, Sal, who had been conspicuously absent the night of Valerius's visit and had never asked a single question about his missing security camera footage from that evening, told the porters to bring it to the kitchen. Leo helped Alara pry open the lid with a crowbar. Inside, nestled in a bed of straw, were dozens of dark green glass bottles. It was olive oil, but it was not just any olive oil. Alara lifted a bottle. It was heavy, the glass cool to the touch. The label was simple, handwritten in elegant Italian script. It named a small, private grove in Sicily, a place known to produce an oil so pure, so flavorful, that it was almost never sold on the open market. It was an oil reserved for kings and popes. A single bottle was worth more than Leo made in a month. There was no note. There didn't need to be. It was a tribute, a sign of respect from one sovereign to another. That night, after the dinner service was over, after the kitchen had been scrubbed and polished back to its state of grace, Alara stood alone in the silence. She opened one of the bottles. The scent that filled the air was not just of olives. It was the smell of sun-drenched earth, of old stone walls, of a place where things were grown with care and integrity. It was the smell of a world built on true foundations. She dipped a piece of day-old bread into the golden green oil and ate it. It tasted of peace, a peace that was not given, but earned. She looked around her small, clean kingdom. She was not a warrior or a spy or an assassin anymore. She was a cook. She was exactly where she needed to be. True power was not the ability to command others, but the discipline to command oneself. It was not found in a boardroom or on a battlefield, but in the quiet courage to stand your ground and defend the small, clean space you had made your own.